I used to believe that my marriage was unshakable, the kind of union that weathered storms without even creaking. For 10 years, my wife, Clara, and I had built a life that, to anyone looking in from the outside, seemed picture-perfect. We owned a modest but warm home on the edge of the city, had 2 cars in the driveway, and hosted dinner parties that often ended with laughter spilling into the early hours. I worked as a mid-level operations manager at a manufacturing company, where I had earned a reputation for being steady, fair, and a mentor to my younger staff. Clara worked part-time as a freelance interior decorator, which gave her the flexibility to design our own home with touches so perfect they could have been plucked from a magazine spread. People often told us we were lucky to have each other. I believed them, until I learned that appearances can be the most dangerous liars of all. If you enjoy stories like this, click on the subscribe button, like this story, and share with your loved ones. Clara had a restless streak, though I used to think of it as a charming quirk. She would suddenly get obsessed with a new hobby, a different hairstyle, or an exotic travel destination she absolutely had to visit. I thought it was part of what made her vibrant, that her hunger for novelty balanced my preference for routine. But over the past year, her restlessness took on a different edge. She started working out more than usual, dressing up even when she had no apparent plans, and scrolling her phone late at night while hiding the screen from me with a practiced tilt of her wrist. I noticed these changes, of course, but I didn't push. I told myself every marriage goes through phases. Pressuring her would only create distance. I convinced myself that trust meant letting her have her privacy. Then there was Daniel. He was one of my younger employees, early 30s, charming, and quick-witted. I'd hired him 3 years ago when he was struggling to get his career off the ground, and I had always thought of him as someone I was guiding toward success. He had that energy that made people instantly comfortable around him, especially women. Clara and Daniel first met at our company's holiday party 2 years ago, and I remember thinking they got along surprisingly well. She laughed at his jokes, and he seemed to find her fascinating. At the time, I thought nothing of it. It was a friendly event, after all. But over the months that followed, I noticed Daniel always seemed more interested in chatting with Clara than anyone else when she came by to drop off lunch or pick me up. Again, I brushed it off. I trusted both of them. That trust was my blind spot. Things began to shift subtly but undeniably. Clara started visiting friends more often, but the friends' names were vague and inconsistent. Her weekend errands began taking hours longer than they should have, and she came home glowing in a way that had nothing to do with groceries or traffic. Around the same time, Daniel began requesting more flexible hours, claiming he was dealing with family issues. I approved them without a second thought, never imagining that I was giving them exactly the windows they needed to build their little secret world. Looking back, I feel almost foolish for how willingly I played into their hands. But in the moment, I thought I was being understanding, compassionate, even. It wasn't until a Thursday afternoon in late spring that the first crack in the facade revealed itself in a way I couldn't ignore. I was in my office catching up on paperwork when I heard Daniel's voice from the break room, low and intimate in a way that didn't match casual workplace chatter. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the laughter that followed froze me in place. It wasn't his laugh, it was Clara's. The sound was distinct, familiar, and laced with that teasing tone she used when she wanted someone to feel special. I stepped quietly into the hall, my mind scrambling to form an explanation, but the door swung shut before I could catch more. By the time I walked into the break room, Daniel was alone, casually scrolling through his phone. I didn't say a word. I just stood there for a moment, letting the weight of suspicion settle in my chest like a stone. For the next week, I paid closer attention. Not in an obvious way, but enough to notice that Daniel's flexible hours always seemed to align with Clara's sudden outings. I also noticed her growing secrecy with her phone, her refusal to let me pick it up when it buzzed, even if she was across the room. I had never been the type to snoop, but one evening, when she left her phone charging in the kitchen while she showered, I found myself standing over it, my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't unlock it. I couldn't bring myself to cross that line, but the sight of Daniel's name in her recent calls was enough to make me lean back against the counter and stare at the ceiling. Something was happening. and it was no longer a question of if. Yet, I didn't confront her. Not yet. Some part of me wanted undeniable proof, something that would end any possibility of doubt or manipulation. Confrontations can be twisted, stories can be spun. I knew Clara well enough to know she would have an explanation ready for anything less than irrefutable evidence. So I decided to wait, to watch, and to let her reveal herself. I thought of it as letting the truth come to me, but deep down, I knew it was also about bracing myself for the blow. The reality was setting in. The life I thought we had, the perfect illusion, was already over. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. I spent the days after that break room laugh moving like a man rehearsing normalcy, performing tasks my hands already knew while my mind paced a locked room. I filed reports, answered emails, and sat in meetings with a focused calm that fooled everyone but me. At night, I studied the patterns I had ignored. The late Pilates class that wasn't on the studio's schedule, the quick coffee with a friend whose Instagram story showed she'd been out of town, the perfume that clung to Clara at midnight like she had been out under a different constellation. I told myself that truth had its own gravity. It didn't need me to force it, only to stop resisting the pull. By the weekend, I had decided that if there was a train coming, I would stand still and let it reveal itself instead of flailing on the tracks. The next Monday, Daniel breezed into the office with a smile that tried too hard to land. "Morning, boss," he said, dropping a file on my desk like a magician revealing nothing up his sleeve. I asked about a client quote, and he nodded earnestly, the way he always did when he wanted to project reliability. "I'll get it to you by 3, he promised. "I'm juggling a few things, family stuff." He let that last phrase hang in the air like a fresh squeezed alibi. I held his gaze for a second longer than usual and said, as evenly as I could, "Handle what you need to. Just keep me posted." He thanked me, and I watched him walk away, feeling something in his stride that wasn't nervousness. Exactly. It was the buoyancy of a man who thought he'd been granted permission to vanish. We had a family cell plan, a remnant of the years when shared discounts felt romantic rather than strategic. I logged into the account that evening under the pretense of checking our data overage. The call logs could not lie. Numbers repeated with a rhythmic insistence, and one of them matched the last 4 digits I'd seen flash across Clara's screen in the kitchen. I didn't need the name. The pattern alone was indictment. Still, I needed more than phone records if I ever had to explain myself. To her, to HR, to a lawyer, to the version of me that couldn't stop thinking of 10 years of holidays and inside jokes. I printed the logs and slid them into a manila folder like I was building a case against a stranger. Maybe I was. I tried the route of kindness by proxy, asking Nadia, Clara's best friend, if she'd help me plan a small surprise dinner. Nadia had always been good at reading the air. She could look around a room and know who was uncomfortable, who was bluffing, who needed saving. We met for coffee on a gray Tuesday, and she studied me over the rim of her mug. "You look tired," she said, not unkindly. I told her I wanted to do something to make Clara feel seen. "Seen?" Nadia repeated, tilting her head. "What exactly is she trying to show you lately?" Her tone had an edge that surprised me. I deflected, and she let it slide, but before we left she touched my sleeve and said, "If something is wrong, don't let it rot." You know how she gets when she thinks she won't be caught. It was the first time someone had acknowledged the storm brewing without naming it, and I walked back to my car feeling both validated and scared of how much Nadia already understood. Clara guarded her phone like it was a passport, but the house was full of small portals that convenience had left unguarded. One evening, while she took a bath and hummed over the sound of running water, I opened the family iPad that synced to our joint email, the one we used for bills and travel confirmations. There it was, as impersonal and merciless as a bank statement. 2 tickets to Puerto Vallarta, departing the following Monday, returning 2 weeks later. The reservation holder was Clara, but the second traveler's name wasn't me. It was Daniel. The itinerary was perfect in its indifference to my feelings. Flight numbers, seat assignments, a hotel with a sunset bar, and an adults-only pool. Beneath it all, a message from the hotel concierge. "We look forward to celebrating your romantic getaway." My hands shook so hard I had to set the tablet down, and I stood there in the kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator drilling into my ears while my life rearranged itself into categories labeled before and after. The next escalation came with technology's favorite cruelty, an accidental voicemail. Daniel had called Clara while she was in the shower, and instead of the line cutting off, his voice spilled into my ears when I picked up later to check a missed call. "Hey, beautiful," he said, the words soft, then sharpening when he lowered his voice. "I got the time off, no problem." He bought the line about my mom being sick. "We're clear. Monday. I can't wait to get you away. Don't worry, I'll keep it cool at the office." He laughed then, a boy's laugh trying to impersonate a man's. Delete this. I listened 3 times, not because I needed the audio to be louder, but because each replay tightened something inside me into a choice. I saved the message to the cloud and backed it up to a drive with the same care you'd use to preserve a family photograph. That night at dinner, I almost tore the curtain down. Clara had made pasta and poured me a full glass of wine, and she was in a light mood that suggested she believed her lies were ironclad. "You've been quiet today," she said, twirling linguine with the grace of someone who never anticipated choking. "Long day." I chewed slowly and nodded. "People surprise me," I said. She smiled, not understanding or pretending not to. "That's life," she replied, and touched my hand as if intimacy could be conjured by muscle memory. "Nadia says we should all go out this weekend. Might be nice, before I head to that design conference next week." She didn't blink when she lied. I almost asked which conference had the ocean, but I swallowed the line and took a sip of wine that tasted like patience. "We'll see," I answered, and watched her gaze flicker, measuring me. I started preparing, the way you do when a storm is on the radar and you finally accept that hitting the gas won't outrun it. I called Marcus, a lawyer I knew from a local business group, and asked him what I needed to do to protect myself if a separation blindsided me. "Document everything," he said. "Stay calm. Don't tip your hand early. And don't put yourself in a position where you look vindictive. Judges love calm people." He added, "If there's an employee involved, tread carefully. HR first, then me, if it goes nuclear." I thanked him and sat on the edge of the bed that night thinking that nothing had exploded yet, but the smell of gasoline was unmistakable. The urge to confront banged at my ribs, but I kept my voice as still as the glass of water on the nightstand and told myself that silence could be strategy, not submission. At work, I handled Daniel like a live wire. On Thursday, he knocked on my door with a tentative smile and asked for time off the following week. "Family emergency," he said, lowering his eyes like he'd learned contrition from a YouTube tutorial. I opened my calendar, added a bland note, and nodded. "Take what you need," I said. "Send me your handover by end of day." He brightened with relief and a hint of smugness, as if outmaneuvering me was a sport he was winning. "Thanks, boss. You're the best," he said, and I nearly laughed at the theater of it. After he left, I typed a memo to HR documenting the conversation and filed it without sending, a folded letter addressed to a future I hoped I wouldn't need. Nadia texted me that evening, an unprompted message that landed like a strike of honest lightning. "I don't know what story she's feeding you, but check the dates she gave you," she wrote. "They don't line up." I stared at the screen, then called her. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, surprised at the steadiness in my own voice. Nadia exhaled. "Because I'm tired of holding her purse while she tiptoes into traffic," she said. "Because you've been kind to her for years. And because when this blows up, and it will, I don't want you thinking everyone who loves her loves the way she burns things." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was relief finding a place to sit down. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it like a prayer. By Saturday, the suitcase appeared at the foot of our bed like a guest that hadn't been invited but refused to leave. Clara packed with a cheerful efficiency, narrating a schedule that included panels, breakfasts, and networking cocktails, while I folded laundry and listened to my life being fictionalized. "You'll be okay for a week?" she asked, zipping the bag. "2." I corrected gently, as if confused. She blinked, then smiled. "Time flies," she said, and kissed my cheek. I watched her walk down the hallway, and the sound of the zipper seemed to echo longer than the kiss. On Monday morning, I left for work early, and parked 2 blocks from the house. A rideshare pulled up at 9, crisp and careless in its timing. Clara stepped out in a sundress that didn't belong to a conference, and Daniel slid into the back seat beside her, lowering his head as if headrests were cameras. They didn't see me. I didn't take a photo. I wasn't collecting trophies. I just watched until the car turned the corner and the world kept turning, which felt like the real offense. The day went on anyway. At my desk, I approved invoices, signed a vendor contract, and answered a question about inventory as if the simple fact of their departure was just a mundane entry on a shared calendar. Before lunch, Nadia sent a final message. "If you need a place to breathe, my door's open." I typed thanks and put my phone face down. I didn't need refuge. I needed resolve. I opened the folder on my desktop labeled Household, and inside it, I created a subfolder labeled Truth. I dragged the airline confirmation, the call logs, the voicemail file, and a screenshot of Daniel's time off request into it. Then I closed the lid of my laptop as if I'd shut a trunk over something that no longer deserved air. It was not revenge, it was inventory. The day their flight lifted into the sky, I sat very still at my desk and felt the oddest sense of calm, like I had finally stopped negotiating with a storm and just let it rain. That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been, as if the walls were relieved not to hold up a lie for once. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it standing at the counter, the way I did before marriage refined my habits. I washed the plate, dried it, and set it back in the cabinet. When I turned off the kitchen light, I saw our reflection in the window, me present, her absent, and thought about the question Nadia had posed without posing it. What exactly was Clara trying to show me? Maybe nothing noble. Maybe just the person she'd always been when novelty called her name. I went to bed without texting her, without pretending to miss her, and when my phone buzzed once in the dark with a notification I didn't open, I smiled to myself at a future that had already changed shape. In the stillness before sleep took me, I made a quiet decision. I would not chase her. I would not warn her. I would let her press send on the first cruel message, and when she did, I would be ready. When her text finally came, it arrived with the smugness of someone who thought they were detonating the final charge in a crumbling building. It was late afternoon, and I had just finished reviewing a quarterly report when my phone buzzed with her name. I almost didn't open it. Part of me wanted to leave it unread forever, to let her words float unanswered in whatever cloud she imagined herself speaking from. But curiosity got the better of me. I have found someone better. I won't return again. You can move on. That was all. No greeting, no softening, no pretended regret, just the neat slicing of our history into before and after. I stared at the screen for a moment, not because the words hurt, but because they didn't. I realized I had been mourning our marriage for weeks already. She was just arriving late to the funeral. The idea that she thought this text would shatter me almost made me laugh. I sat back in my chair, letting the numbers from the report fade from my mind. The office around me carried on in its usual hum. Phones ringing, printers spitting out contracts, someone in the hallway talking too loudly about a delivery delay. In another life, this would have been the moment my pulse spiked, my chest tightened, and my fingers hovered over the keyboard to plead or rage or demand an explanation. Instead, I felt something colder and cleaner, freedom wrapped in finality. I didn't need her explanations. I already had the truth filed neatly in my truth folder at home. I didn't need to plead for understanding. I had already understood more than she would ever admit. So I did the simplest thing possible. I smiled, blocked her number, and deleted her contact entirely. It wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute. In that moment, the version of me who had once needed her approval simply stopped existing. Blocking her didn't feel like shutting a door. It felt like opening a window in a stuffy room. The air in my life shifted instantly. Lighter, cooler, free from the stale mix of suspicion and forced affection that had been choking me. I sat there for a moment, wondering if she was watching her phone, waiting for my response, rehearsing how she'd twist my pain into her own justification. Maybe she imagined I'd demand to know who someone better was. Maybe she wanted me to fight for her, to prove I still cared enough to be hurt. Instead, she'd get silence, a silence that said, You don't matter enough for me to argue with anymore. I closed my laptop, left the office on time for the first time in weeks, and walked to my car without once thinking about where she might be or who she might be with. Over the next few days, I carried on as though the message had never come. I showed up at work, approved purchase orders, held my Monday meeting without a hitch, and even cracked a few jokes with the staff. Daniel's absence was an unspoken ghost in the office. His desk sat tidy and untouched, the potted plant by his monitor starting to wilt from neglect. No one asked where he was. Perhaps they assumed I'd given him leave, or maybe they sensed that the air around his name was charged and best avoided. I didn't volunteer information. I had no intention of letting this story unfold anywhere but in my own controlled timeline. If Clara thought she had left me drowning, she would never know I had already learned how to swim without her months ago. It's a strange thing, to be betrayed and yet feel unburdened. Every evening that week, I drove home to a house that felt more like mine than it ever had when she was in it. I cooked simple meals, played the music I liked without worrying about her mood, and went to bed without waiting for the creak of the front door signaling her late return. I didn't snoop on her social media or ask mutual friends for updates. I didn't need to know where she was because I already knew how this story would end, just not the exact date. She was chasing a fantasy with a man who liked the thrill more than the commitment, and the moment reality arrived, he'd drop her. Some people don't change their nature, they just change their company. Daniel was one of them. By Friday, I was almost amused at how predictable it all felt. I pictured her on some tropical balcony, wine glass in hand, laughing too loudly at Daniel's jokes, telling herself she had made the right choice. But I also knew how fast a man like Daniel would sour once the novelty wore off, how quickly the flattering attention would turn into irritation, then boredom, then retreat. It wasn't a question of if he'd abandon her, it was just a matter of which excuse he'd use. I imagined the scene clearly. Her realizing she had no safety net, no one to turn to without swallowing her pride. I wondered how long it would take before she reached out, rewriting her story as a misunderstanding, a joke gone wrong, an impulsive decision made under stress. And when she did, I knew I'd be ready to respond with the same finality I'd shown when she first messaged me. That weekend, I got a text from Nadia, nothing about Clara, just a picture of her making coffee with the caption, "Best start to the day." It was simple, almost innocent, but it made me think about the difference between someone who quietly adds to your life and someone who takes from it without noticing. I didn't know then where things with Nadia would go, only that our conversations felt easy in a way mine with Clara hadn't for years. There was no performance, no careful editing of truth. She asked how I was doing, and when I told her I was fine, she said, "Good. Stay that way," without offering false comfort or fishing for gossip. That small exchange anchored me in the knowledge that I was already moving on, not to someone else yet, but away from who I had been with Clara. The following Monday, a week after her grand declaration, the email arrived. The subject line read simply, "About last week." I almost didn't open it, but the petty part of me wanted to see how she'd spin the collapse. The message was short, just a few lines claiming that her text had been a joke, that she hadn't meant it seriously, and that she'd be home soon. She even threw in a line about how she missed me and was looking forward to starting fresh. No apology, no acknowledgement of the man she had traveled with, just a thin attempt to reset the game as if she hadn't flipped the board over in front of me. I didn't respond immediately. I let the email sit in my inbox like an unopened bill. She had made her choice, and I had made mine the second I hit block on her number. When I finally replied, I kept it short. "I've moved on. I'm not expecting you to come back." No theatrics, no accusations, no desperate need for her to admit anything. Just the truth, plain and unadorned. I hit send, closed the email, and went on with my day. Whatever fantasy she had been chasing was over, and whatever fantasy she thought she could return to with me was gone too. Somewhere out there, she would read that message and realize the door wasn't just closed. It was locked, bolted, and bricked over. And I felt nothing but peace about it. Her email read like someone trying to climb back into a burning house and insisting the heat was a misunderstanding. About last week, the subject line announced, as if we'd shared a joke and let it get out of hand. She wrote that the text had been playful, that distance made her dramatic, that she missed my steadiness, and would be back soon to reset. There was no mention of Daniel, no accounting for the itinerary I'd seen, no apology that called itself by its name. I recognized the cadence. When Clara felt the ground shifting under her, she replaced facts with tone. If she sounded warm enough, vague enough, needy enough, the story might return to the one where she was impulsive, not unfaithful. But this time, her magic trick had run out of smoke. The truth stood there, patient and concrete, while her language tried and failed to turn it into fog. I answered with the economy I'd earned the hard way. I've moved on. I'm not expecting you to come back. Then I did what a future version of me would thank me for. I locked down the practical pieces she had always treated like background music. I changed the smart lock codes, the Wi-Fi password, the streaming logins, and the shared cloud storage where our life had hung like framed photos. I moved half the savings into an account under my name, left a paper trail Marcus would approve of, and set up alerts on the credit cards. This wasn't cruelty. This was oxygen mask protocol. On my lunch break, I drove home, stood in the foyer where we used to laugh as we kicked off our shoes, and tapped a new access code into the panel. It beeped its confirmation in a flat tone that felt exactly right. No judgment, only fact. The flood began that evening. First a new email, subject line, "Can we talk?" Then a call from an unknown number, then another, then a voicemail. I let each ring out, a metronome counting down the last beats of a rhythm I no longer danced to. When I finally listened to the voicemail, her voice stumbled out, raw around the edges. I was kidding, okay? You know how I am. Please don't be dramatic. 30 seconds later, a second message arrived, older and shakier. I need to come home. Things got complicated. The pauses told the story the nouns avoided. I saved both voicemails and put my phone face down. Somewhere, perhaps in a hotel lobby that looked less romantic in daylight, Clara was realizing the fantasy didn't negotiate with rent, with return flights, with a lover who liked her best when she cost him nothing. I sat at our kitchen table and felt the strange mercy of not needing to sympathize. Work required a different kind of discipline. The morning after her second voicemail, I scheduled a meeting with HR, shut the door gently, and spoke like a man who valued his name. I laid out what I could verify, without speculation. The time-off request Daniel had submitted, the dates aligning with Clara's claimed conference, the backlog of deliverables now dangling, and the voicemail that referenced keeping it cool at the office. I didn't play the audio, I summarized. I asked to be recused from any investigation and from any decision about his employment. The director nodded, grateful for the restraint, and assured me they would handle it. On my way back to my office, I passed Daniel's empty chair and felt no victory. Only the dull clarity that consequences don't need cheering sections. Shortly after lunch, HR placed him on administrative leave pending review. A bland memo went out company-wide that said nothing at all. Inside it, the air shifted. He broke the silence with one graceless email to my work account, timestamped 1:07 p.m., subject line conversation. He wrote that he respected me, that the timing had been bad, that he hoped we could keep things professional. It was the vocabulary of a man who had only ever rehearsed excuses, not accountability. I didn't respond. The boundaries I set with Clara extended here. I would not furnish anyone a stage on which to pretend their choices were accidents. Near 5, I closed my laptop and caught my reflection in the dark screen. I didn't look triumphant. I looked like a man who had learned how to be still while a storm yelled itself hoarse. On my drive home, my hands relaxed on the wheel, and I understood something my father used to say when a job got ugly: finish it clean. The social fallout started to blossom in weird, modern ways. Half-truths sprouting in group chats like mushrooms after rain. A cousin texted to ask if I was okay, with a performative concern that smelled like secondhand gossip. A coworker's girlfriend DM'd me to say she'd heard Clara was traveling and hoped we were taking time for ourselves. I kept my replies economical. I'm fine. Thanks. Nadia, to her credit, didn't fish. She sent a text that read, You don't owe anyone context. Want coffee? We met after work at a quiet place that didn't ask your name 3 times before pouring. She slid a latte toward me and studied my face. You look different, she said. Not broken. Just done. I told her about the emails, the calls, the voicemail with its swallowed confession. Nadia didn't flinch. She always thinks timing is a moral argument, she said. You don't have to argue back. By Wednesday, the shape of Clara's collapse was obvious even from a distance. A terser email arrived. Daniel and I are taking a break. He's not who I thought. 3 minutes later, my return flight is on Friday. 20 minutes after that, please don't make this harder. I let her words sit where they landed. On a screen, not inside me. I wrote one final note, more practical than poetic. Your things will be outside the house on Friday by 5 p.m. Do not attempt to enter. We will arrange a time next week to discuss logistics through counsel. Do not contact me by phone again. I CC'd Marcus, not as a threat, but as a structure. Then I closed the laptop and stood in the middle of the living room that she had curated into a magazine spread. The furniture looked beautiful and temporarily homeless, like it was waiting to learn which story it would be part of next. Thursday brought the kind of mundane labor that feels like ritual. I pulled her clothes from the closet and folded them carefully, not as an absolution, but as a refusal to make a mess. I boxed her shoes by pairs, slid her jewelry into zippered pouches, and wrapped frames that held her family in brown paper as if they were antique plates. I left the wedding album untouched. Some artifacts stay in the museum for court to catalog. Between boxes, I answered a few emails, watered the ficus she liked, and took a call from Marcus confirming we were on solid footing. Keep documenting. Keep calm, he said again. After I hung up, I texted Nadia to thank her for the coffee and for not asking me to narrate my pain. She replied with a single line, proud of your spine, and somehow it felt like a hand at the small of my back guiding me forward without pushing. The escalation I didn't expect arrived that afternoon as a voicemail from an unfamiliar woman who identified herself as Daniel's on-and-off girlfriend, the kind of title that carries its own weather. I thought you should know, she began, the anger in her voice crisp and oddly protective. He's been telling people you were cool with it, that you knew and didn't care. I'm sorry for my part in any of this. He lies like he breathes. I saved the message with the others, not to hoard pain, but to keep the record straight. There's a relief in facts, even ugly ones. They stop the bleeding of narrative. I sat on the back steps as evening slid in, the boxes lined up in the hallway like a modest procession, and I felt the loneliness of endings wrap around my shoulders like a coat I chose to wear. I wasn't devastated. I was alert, and I was tired. Friday came with a strange brightness, as if the sun had made a private promise to show up for me. I stacked her boxes near the front door and carried them to the porch 2 at a time. Neighbors passed on dog walks and offered the polite half-smiles people give when they sense a story, but know better than to ask. Around 4:30, I placed her folded clothes, 3 labeled totes, and a garment bag beside the boxes. I set a sealed envelope on top addressed to her, containing the locksmith's invoice, a short list of next steps through counsel, and the access code that would work for exactly 1 hour the following week to retrieve anything she claimed we'd missed. When I stepped back, the porch looked like a photograph of a boundary. The house behind me felt lighter, not because I had removed a person, but because I had removed an argument pretending to be a life. At 4:52 p.m., my phone lit with a rideshare notification I hadn't asked for. Passenger arriving, Clara. I watched the little car icon crawl up our street on the map, that cartoon geometry making something raw feel almost silly. I turned off the porch light. Daylight was enough truth, and closed the front door with a quiet click. Inside, the living room held its breath. I moved to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and rested my palms on the cool counter. From down the block came the rubbery sound of tires easing to a stop, a door opening, a suitcase's wheels stuttering over cracked concrete. For a heartbeat, I saw the past try to surge up and plead its case. Then another sound cut through, the quick rhythm of footsteps I knew well, headed toward a house that no longer recognized their owner. I took a slow breath, set the glass down, and prepared to let silence do the talking. When I finally opened the front door, I didn't step onto the porch. I stood just inside, framed by the doorway like a man prepared to hand over the last piece of evidence in a trial he no longer cared to attend. Clara was standing at the edge of the porch, her eyes darting between the boxes and my face. She had on that dress she wore when she wanted to look effortless, but travel had wrinkled it, and her makeup couldn't quite hide the exhaustion pooling under her eyes. "You're really doing this?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and accusation, as though she were the wronged party. I didn't answer with a speech. I simply gestured to the boxes, then to the sealed envelope. The weight of my silence made her fidget. "This is petty," she muttered. "You're throwing away 10 years. I wanted to laugh at the selective arithmetic, how easily she could subtract her months with Daniel from that sum. But I just stepped back and let the air between us widen. From behind me came the sound of soft footsteps, and then Nadia appeared, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder before she stepped forward. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a white blouse, but her presence carried a calm gravity that instantly changed the atmosphere. Clara's eyes snapped to her, widening first in shock, then in dawning recognition that was equal parts betrayal and wounded pride. "You?" Clara's voice cracked around the word, as if it had been forced through glass. Nadia didn't flinch. "Me," she said plainly, and there was no malice in her tone, just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had teeth. Clara's gaze flicked between us, trying to decide if this was some elaborate revenge or the result of a betrayal so unthinkable it hadn't crossed her mind until now. I stayed still, letting her do the math in her head without helping her with the equation. Her next words came sharp and bitter. "You're sleeping with my best friend?" It was meant to sting, but the phrase "best friend" hung in the air like a brand name she no longer owned the rights to. I thought about the nights Nadia had called me after sensing something was wrong, the coffee meetings where she had asked nothing and offered everything, the way she had shown up without fanfare or agenda. "Your best friend," I said slowly, "chose to love someone who respects her. You didn't." I could see the retort forming on Clara's lips, but it faltered when she glanced at Nadia and found no shame, only steadiness. The truth was that Nadia hadn't stolen me. She had simply been there in the wreckage, not to rescue me, but to stand beside me while I figured out where to walk next. That kind of loyalty doesn't have to ask for permission to become love. Clara's voice dropped to a hiss, the kind she used when she wanted to look composed but couldn't keep the venom out. "You're a betrayer," she said, the word curling in her mouth like she'd just discovered it. I thought about correcting her, pointing out that betrayal isn't contagious. You don't catch it from the person you've betrayed, but I didn't. I'd learned that explanations are just invitations for more lies. "Call it whatever you want," I replied, my voice calm enough to make her blink. "It changes nothing." Nadia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hand found mine, fingers threading through with a quiet finality that said more than any defense could. Clara's gaze fell to our joined hands, and something flickered across her face. Not just anger, but the realization that she no longer had the power to dictate the ending of this story. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the porch, and for a moment, the scene felt suspended in amber. Me in the doorway, Nadia by my side, Clara on the edge of what used to be hers. She bent down and lifted one of the boxes, more to reclaim dignity than to lighten the load. "Fine," she said, her voice now sharp with the brittle edge of someone who has lost the audience. "Enjoy each other. You'll regret it." The irony hung there, unacknowledged. She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the pavement, the sound receding until the rideshare's door shut behind her. I didn't watch the car pull away. Some departures deserve only the acknowledgement of absence, not the ceremony of farewell. When the sound was gone, the porch seemed to exhale, and the space she had occupied became just air again. Inside, Nadia closed the door softly, as though sealing something fragile. "You okay?" she asked. It wasn't the kind of question that demanded a brave face. It was the kind that left room for truth. I nodded, not out of habit, but because I was. "Better than okay," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. We carried the envelope of her keys and remaining documents to the desk, setting it beside the truth folder that had grown heavier over the weeks. The living room felt warmer now, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight in the air had lifted. Nadia sat on the couch and patted the cushion beside her. I joined her, and for the first time in what felt like months, I let my shoulders fully relax. We didn't talk about Clara after that. Instead, we planned dinner, something simple but celebratory, not for the fact that Clara was gone, but for the fact that the chapter had closed cleanly. I grilled chicken while Nadia made a salad, the sound of chopping and sizzling filling the spaces where silence might have been awkward. Over dinner, we laughed about nothing in particular, the kind of laughter that isn't covering anything up, and I realized this was what I had been missing for years: ease. There was no tension humming under the table, no second-guessing the meaning behind a glance or a pause. We ate, we talked, we lingered, and the night stretched out like it belonged to us entirely. After the dishes were done, we sat on the porch with 2 glasses of wine, the air cool and carrying the scent of jasmine from the neighbor's yard. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Nadia leaned against me, and I wrapped an arm around her without thinking about who might see. There was no performance here, no need to present a curated version of happiness. She didn't need me to be perfect, and I didn't need her to be a symbol of victory over Clara. We were just 2 people who had found each other at the exact moment we were both willing to be real. The past was still there, of course, its echo faint in the background, but it no longer dictated the terms of my present. And for the first time in a long time, I believed the future could be built on something solid. When I went inside later and turned off the lights, I glanced once toward the porch where Clara's things had been just hours earlier. The space was empty, but it didn't feel vacant. It felt ready for dinners without tension, for mornings without suspicion, for the slow, steady work of making a life with someone who didn't treat love like a game with points to score. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't in the spectacle of her seeing me with Nadia. It was in living a life that no longer required revenge at all. That thought settled over me like a blanket, and as I headed upstairs, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The morning after Clara left for the last time, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. It was a steady, unhurried rain, the kind that makes you slow down, listen, and notice the quiet inside your own house. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the stillness settle into me like something earned. There was no waiting for the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs, no mental calculations about her mood, no guessing games about where she had been. Just rain, the creak of the old wood in the walls, and the warmth of a bed I didn't have to share with suspicion. I realized then that this was what peace actually felt like, not a loud celebration, but a quiet absence of chaos. And I knew I wasn't going to give that up for anyone. Not for nostalgia, not for guilt, not for the version of Clara that existed only in my old, selective memories. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the water trail down the glass. On the counter, the truth folder sat where I'd left it, a small monument to the weeks I had spent collecting the reality of my own life. It wasn't just evidence, it was the map I had followed out of a place I didn't belong anymore. Inside it was everything I would ever need if Clara decided to spin the story differently. The itinerary, the call logs, the voicemails, the messages from people who had seen through her before I had. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Just knowing it was there gave me a sense of completion, like sealing a box and labeling it before sliding it onto the highest shelf. It was part of my past, and it would stay there until it served a legal purpose or turned to dust, whichever came first. Nadia joined me in the kitchen a few minutes later, her hair loose, her eyes still carrying the softness of sleep. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, not asking what I was thinking, not filling the air with unnecessary words. "You slept well?" she said, more observation than question. I nodded, smiling faintly. "Better than I have in years." She took a sip, then said, "Good. That's how it should be." There was something so grounding in the way she said it. Without judgment, without pretense, that I felt the knot in my chest loosen just a little more. With Clara, mornings had been a performance. With Nadia, they were simply mornings. And in that simplicity, There was more intimacy than I had ever known in the forced warmth of my old marriage. Later that day, Marcus called to check in. "You're in the clear," he said. "HR's handling Daniel, and your side is airtight if anything legal comes up." I thanked him, and he chuckled. "You're one of the calmest clients I've ever had going through something like this. Most people swing between rage and bargaining. You just moved forward." I thought about that for a moment before replying. That's because I was done long before she told me to move on. We said our goodbyes, and I hung up feeling the truth of my own words. The end of my marriage hadn't been a cliff I fell from. It had been a shoreline I quietly walked away from while the tide went out behind me. Clara might have thought she'd left me stranded, but in reality, I'd already found another coast. 2 days later, Clara sent one final email. This one was longer, threaded with just enough self-pity to sound like regret. She said she didn't recognize me anymore, that she had made mistakes but didn't deserve this level of cruelty. She accused me of humiliating her by moving on so quickly and with someone she had trusted. She called it betrayal, as if my loyalty had been some kind of lifelong contract she could breach without consequence. I read the whole thing twice, not because I doubted my decision, but because I wanted to see if there was anything in her words that might stir the old reflex to fix, to compromise, to make peace. There wasn't. All I saw was a woman shocked to find herself on the receiving end of the indifference she had once shown me. I closed the email without replying. Some arguments win themselves by refusing to be fought. Nadia and I didn't celebrate that moment with champagne or grand gestures. Instead, we went to the farmer's market, bought fresh bread and tomatoes, and came home to make lunch. It was ordinary, almost boring, and it was perfect. We ate on the back porch, listening to the rain taper off, the air fresh and cool. She told me about a new project she was starting. I told her about a book I'd been meaning to read, and the conversation moved easily from one topic to the next without tripping over old wounds. That was the real victory. Not that I'd won over Clara, but that I'd stepped into a life where winning wasn't even the point anymore. The best revenge wasn't replacing her. It was living in a way that made her absence irrelevant. That night, I sat alone for a while after Nadia went to bed. I thought about the man I had been when Clara first left, the one who could have chased her, argued with her, tried to prove he was worth staying for. That man had been buried quietly over the past weeks, replaced by someone who understood the difference between being chosen and being settled for. Clara had chosen someone else, and in doing so, she had freed me from the version of myself that would have kept taking her back. I didn't know her the kind of forgiveness that invites a person to hurt you again. The only forgiveness I needed to give was to myself, for ignoring the signs, for shrinking my own needs to fit hers, for thinking love was supposed to survive at any cost. Before I went upstairs, I looked out the front window one last time at the porch where her things had sat, waiting for her that day. The space was empty now, washed clean by the rain, but I could still picture the boxes, the garment bag, the way she had looked at me like she couldn't decide if she was angry or impressed. I realized it didn't matter which it had been. I had made my choice, and it was final, not because I needed to prove anything to her, but because I had finally learned that keeping my boundaries was not cruelty. It was care. Care for myself, for the life I wanted to build, and for the people who actually valued me. The next morning, I woke before the alarm and lay there in the quiet, listening not to rain this time, but to the sound of Nadia breathing beside me. I thought about how far I'd come from the man who had once stood in his office, phone in hand, reading the message that was supposed to break him. That message hadn't broken me, it had freed me. And as I got up to start the day, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Clara thought of me now, it didn't matter. My life was my own again, and I intended to keep it that way. Some people think walking away is the hardest choice. For me, the hardest part was accepting that the person I loved was never coming back, not the version I needed anyway. In the end, I didn't slam the door to hurt her. I closed it to protect myself. So I'll ask you, if someone you loved betrayed you this deeply, would you take them back after they claimed it was just a joke? Or would you stand firm and build your life without them? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you soon.